Welcome back to Labor Economics. We're going to start this lesson with what we call a labor supply puzzle. So what I'd like you to do is, in your notes, we're going to start with an activity where I'm going to name a price, and I want you to write down how many hours per week you would work at that particular price. So a couple assumptions here. Assume there's no better job for you, right? This is just your job. You graduate from college and you live in a world where this is what you can get. So assume that's the best you can get. Try not to assume any raises, or if there are raises, it's just inflation. And also assume this job won't go away. So you'd always be able to make this kind of money on the job. So what I want you to start with, so I will name the price. I want you to write the price down and then how many hours per week you would work. Okay, the first price we're going to mention $7.50 per hour. At $7.50 an hour, if you worked, just for a frame of reference, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, you would make $15,000 a year, 1-5. So go ahead, take a moment. You can pause after any of these numbers if you want more time to think about it, but write down how many hours per week you would work if $7.50 per hour was the wage you could get. Okay, now I want you to think about a new wage. Instead of $7.50 an hour, imagine it was $10 per hour. And that's how much you could make. Once again, there aren't better jobs out there for you, and you can always keep getting this $10 an hour. So go ahead and write down how many hours per week you'd work at $10 an hour. Now what I'd like you to do is think about $15 per hour. $15 per hour, 40 hours per week, 58 weeks per year, that's $30,000 a year. So at $15 per hour, how many hours per week would you work? Okay. Next, I'd like you to consider $25 an hour. How many hours per week would you work? The next wage would be $50 per hour. How many hours per week would you work? $50 per hour if you work full-time, that's about $100,000 a year. Now what about $100 an hour? How many hours per week would you work if you made $100 per hour? I'm going to take a jump to $500 per hour. This would be if you worked the full time, as we mentioned a few times, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks per year, that would be $1 million a year. How many hours per week would you work? Remember, this is the best you can do, is what we said before. Now, obviously this is pretty good, but these wages aren't going away, right? So you don't have to try to work now because it's going to be gone. Imagine this is always what you'll be able to earn. The final one then is, what about $10,000 per hour? If you could make $10,000 per hour, how many hours per week would you work? The reason I wanted you to go through this is there's been a bit of a puzzle we've seen with the labor supply. Just as wages have risen, hours worked have decreased. So on your notes, I want you to look back. Did your hours worked per week ever drop? Usually I see about for 2/3 of the individuals who will fill this out, at some point they'll decide to work fewer hours per week. Maybe it's going from 500 to maybe it's going from the $100 an hour to $500 per hour. You realize, yeah, maybe I can cut back 5-10 hours per week. I'll still have plenty of money to enjoy life. Others it's lower, others it's the highest. But if we think about the supply curve, right, we have a law of supply. And the law of supply says, as the price goes up, you should keep working more, right? So something seems a bit off on this, and there's a pretty good reason for that. This isn't typical supply because there's two effects, competing effects that occur when wages go up. The first is what we call a substitution effect, and the other is an income effect. And we're going to look at both of these, but both of these effects examine how much leisure time a person would buy. So how much leisure time would a person purchase? So the substitution effect, that substitution effect of a wage increase, the resulting incentive to work more because of the higher relative reward to labor. Right? If you ever increase the hours you would work, I'm guessing what you were thinking is they're paying me more. That's a better incentive to work. Another way to think about this is leisure time becomes more expensive. So imagine somebody like Donald Trump, who does make maybe $20 million per year. It's about $1,000 per hour if you break it out, full-time wages. For him to go golfing instead of working, if it's a 4-hour round of golf, that costs him $4,000 if that golf is completely leisure time. Or an hour television show costs him $1,000, right? Leisure time is expensive because he could make $1,000 an hour. Whereas somebody who's making the minimum wage, leisure time's really cheap. It costs you $7.50 an hour. So the substitution effect says that as you make more money, you have more of an incentive to work because leisure time is more expensive. So that's one of the two effects. Workers will buy less leisure time. The other effect that pushes us in the other direction is the income effect. So Donald Trump, that 4-hour round of golf might cost $4,000. However, he has enough money he can actually afford to buy that, right? There's a rise in purchasing power for making all this extra money. You could afford to buy more leisure. So if you become richer because you get a rise in wages, you may demand more of lots of different things. You might want a better vacation, you might want a better car, and you might want more leisure time. Right? These are all things you might have an increased demand for. Well, the income effect indicates you should buy more leisure. So one of the effects says you should buy less leisure, the other says you should buy more leisure. As we said, we have competing effects here. So what does that mean for our labor supply curve? It means it's an unusual labor supply curve. So we're going to graph this in a moment, but what typically we see is the substitution effect seems dominant for low-wage workers, whereas the income effect dominates after some point in time. So we'll put this on the board in just a moment. We're going to graph the labor supply curve now. We've got quantity in terms of hours worked and price. What the empirical evidence indicates about the labor supply curve is that for low wages, increases in wages do tend to increase hours worked, which would mean the substitution effect dominates for low-wage workers. However, at some point, the income effect counteracts that, where people don't want to work more. They work about the same, right? The income effect pulls them to work less, but the substitution effect pulls them to work more, and they end up working about the same. But then eventually, the income effect dominates, and so you get a supply curve that looks really unusual. And what this is called is the backward bending labor supply curve. So this curve is backward bending labor supply curve.